try to blow my mind. I don't care.
Peace, Black family. So thank you for joining me yet again on another episode of After the Revolution, where we cover all things dealing with Haitian culture, history, people, and events. So today we'll be discussing the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. If you're not familiar with the Wilmington insurrection, also known as the Wilmington Massacre, it was an insurrection created by white supremacists in Wilmington who were jealous of the economical and political power that black people at the time was having in Wilmington, South Carolina.
In the late 1800s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the state's largest city. It had a majority black population, and historians today describe it as a rarity in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899. That meant North Carolina now had a government that shared power between black and white politicians, including a newly elected Republican governor. Together, they moved towards reforms that would favor black Americans and working-class whites.
This was something that the Democratic Party folks were simply not going to accept.
A multiracial government wasn't just a disappointment for Democrats. It was more like a humiliation. They needed a plan to take back control of the state in the next election. So party leaders like Furnifold Simmons, future U.S. Senator, Charles Aycock, future North Carolina governor, and this man, Alfred Moore Waddell, came up with one: to beat the Fusion Party by luring white populist voters away from their alliance with black voters. Wilmington, with a large black population and a local fusion government in power, would be a focus of their campaign. The State Democratic Party Handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it." Their most effective tool was the media. One of North Carolina's biggest newspapers was a Democratic Party mouthpiece. It ran racist political cartoons throughout 1898.
Not everybody was literate in 1898, but to see a political cartoon of the type that ran, you may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
Now this insurrection, just like Tulsa, Oklahoma and Rosewood, Florida, was fueled by ideas of black men wanting to sleep with white women.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule, even though the fusion government was mostly white. They also played up another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme. White men need to do all that they can to protect white womanhood.
This was all part of North Carolina Democratic strategy, but it echoed the national racist rhetoric of the time. In one speech that Democrats printed in Wilmington paper, a prominent Georgia writer named Rebecca Felton said,
"If it takes lynching a black man a day to protect white womanhood, I say lynch."
Her speech prompted a Wilmington black man named Alex Manley, owner of the black-run Daily Record newspaper, to respond with a column. He made a simple observation that, at the time, was shocking.
That white women who had liaisons with black men did so voluntarily and enthusiastically.
Manley wrote, "Every Negro lynched is called a big burly black brute, when in fact many were sufficiently attractive for white girls to fall in love with them."
Manley pretty much said, in a nutshell, sometimes white women choose to be with black men.
Manley's editorial became another tool for Democrats. Newspapers reprinted it, called it a horrid slander, and ran comments about it on a daily basis. It was just a few months before the election, and white voters were angry.
By the time the election rolls around on November 8th, black voters, Republican voters, had been thoroughly intimidated here.
By all accounts, the elections of 1898 were a sham. The Democratic Party had a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts. They attacked and blocked black residents from voting. At a rally just before the election, Alfred Moore Waddell provoked the crowds. He said, "Negro office holding ought at once and forever be brought to an end, even if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses." The votes were counted, and the Democrats won.
Democratic candidates won every seat they had a candidate up for election in.
But some local fusionist politicians remained in power because their seats hadn't been up for re-election, like the white Republican mayor and the Board of Aldermen. And of course, the election did nothing to undo the economic power black folks held in the city. The Democrats had won the election, but their goal of total white supremacist control remained out of reach.
And so they engineered what was essentially a coup d'etat.
The day after the election, at a gathering for white men in Wilmington, the Democrats unveiled a document called the White Declaration of Independence. It contained an ultimatum. Cynthia Brown, whose descendants were in Wilmington back in 1898, is a historian at her church where there's a preserved copy of the Declaration from the next day's newspaper.
"We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin."
They would strip black men of voting rights. They would give white men a large part of the employment heretofore given to black men. And as for Alex Manly, "We demand that he leave this city forever within 24 hours. The next morning, hundreds of white men marched to the offices of the Daily Record. Manly was gone. He had fled to save his own life. They set the Daily Record building on fire. This is where it once stood.
Once the white leadership destroyed Alex Manly's printing press, they destroyed one way in which the African American community in Wilmington could organize itself and keep itself informed.
At City Hall, the mayor and Board of Aldermen were forced out.
There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Waddell, who once threatened to fill the Cape Fear River with black bodies, was the new mayor of Wilmington. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled into the streets. In these photos, X's mark where the first black residents were killed.
The stories are that they were dumped into the river, and there are varying stories about how many people were killed.
I see 40 to 60 clearly as fatalities as a result of the violence, but I think it was higher.
Many black residents hid for days in the swamps and the wooded cemeteries in the city, including Cynthia's great-grandmother. And thousands of other residents fled Wilmington, never to return. Shortly afterward, Democrats printed booklets celebrating a glorious victory, and in the newspapers depicted black residents as the instigators.
This image is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened during 1898. You know, what you see is African American men with guns, not white men with machine guns.
The city never regained its black majority population. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests and poll taxes that prevented black people from voting were immediately enacted, and Wilmington's spirit of black opportunity was crushed. Black political representation in the state was over. It would be 90 years until North Carolina elected its next black Congress member.
Now you're probably wondering, what does this insurrection have to do with Haitian history, culture, people, and events? Well, one individual who was a member of the United States of Representatives from South Carolina was a mixed-race individual named Robert C. Delarge.
He was born the product of a mixed-race relationship. His mother was a Haitian free woman of color who worked as a seamstress, and his father was a Sephardic Jew who worked as a tailor.
Unfortunately, most scholars believe that his parents was involved in the slave trade or they were slaveholders. Both parents put a huge emphasis on education when it came to the rearing of Robert. Coincidentally, as a young man, the fact that Robert was a mixed race individual, he actually joined the Brown Fellowship Society. Now, the Brown Fellowship Society was made up of a group of people of color who had been freed before the Civil War. And one of the ways that you had to enter into this Brown Fellowship Society is that you had to pass the brown paper bag test, which means that you had to be lighter than a brown paper bag. Now, it is said that these group of people were among the elite of the African American community within the city, and were skilled artisans, and also they led the people of color. Sadly, this was a form of colorism that existed back then, and it still exists in some African countries, cultures, and people's minds, where we uplift the lighter skinned people to be our representatives. So although Robert C. Delarge will not be the ideal person we will want to highlight on this channel, I feel it still is important to tell his story because it shows that there was a connection. It shows that Haitian people were here before the Civil War and before the American Revolution. Although Robert has had a checkered past, joining the Brown Fellowship Society and helping the Confederate Army, I do want to say that he did, after the war, become a prominent figure in the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction.
During the Civil War, he was employed by the Confederate Navy. After the war, he worked as a Republican in the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was an agency set up by the War Department in 1865 to assist formerly enslaved people freed from slavery by the emancipation in obtaining relief, land, jobs, fair treatment, and education.
And if you don't know what Reconstruction is, it was a part of time in history where black people were giving a lot of assistance to help themselves rebuild the nation and help themselves build their communities that have been targeted and destroyed. So in conclusion, a lot of the information that I found on Robert Delarge was very limited. So if you have some information that can enlighten me, please share it in the comment section because I would love to learn more about his story. There is no real history on how he died at such a young age at 31. But hopefully you enjoyed this video showing how, although his mother wasn't the Haitian that we want to highlight, showing how, you know, Haitians were here in the United States prior to the Civil War and post-Civil War. So again, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this information. If you have any information on Robert C. Delarge, please share with me. I would love to do an extended video on him. Just because the limited information that I had on him on Wikipedia and in some of the books was very, very short. So until next time, family, think black, stay black, love black, support black, and that's real African black power.